Nearly every aspect of the end of Game of Thrones earned ire from the majority of the show and book fandom. But one aspect of the show's conclusion that seems to have frustrated fans across the board was the ending for Jaime Lannister. More specifically, that after a seemingly solid and nearly complete redemption arc, he returned to Cersei and King's Landing to die in a manner that somewhat works as a metaphor, but didn't resonate well with the audience at all. And, while Jaime's ending was a flop, it didn't fail for the reasons that many viewers seem to think it did. The Lannisters are obviously some of the most complex and important characters in A Song of Ice and Fire. But one of the most interesting aspects of their family dynamic is that it was established far before the contemporary storyline actually began. And, while Game of Thrones seemed to paint it as if Cersei was a source of toxicity that Tyrion and Jaime couldn't get out from under the thumb of, the truth is that the bad apple that spoiled the bunch was never Cersei, it was always Tywin. One of the most meaningful and important themes of George R.R. Martin's work is the long-term effects that abuse has on children. And there isn't really any example that is more present and potent than the horrific effects that Tywin's abuse had on all of his children, and how it affected them in different ways. Jaime, Cersei, and Tyrion all have some of the most intriguing points of view in the entire story. And one aspect that all of their POVs seem to share in common is that while nearly everyone in their world perceives them as a villain, they all see themselves as victims. And the truth is, both sides of this coin are correct. Yes, the Lannister children have done many horrific, irredeemable things in their lives. But they have also been the victims of extremely traumatic abuse that understandably altered their outlook on the world and on themselves in general. There's a balance between victim and perpetrator that needs to be struck with their characters, but one of Game of Thrones' bigger flaws was its inability to do that. Unsurprisingly, nearly every character's book point of view grants themselves more sympathy than they should. Almost everyone sees themselves as a better person than they are, or is capable of rationalizing away their bad deeds and focusing on their more positive decisions and personality traits. But this is, of course, one of the many ways in which George R.R. Martin utilizes his POV traps. Translating a story that's told through the eyes of the characters themselves and filming it from a more objective third-person perspective means that plenty of important information is going to be lost in that translation. But one of the fatal flaws when it comes to the Lannisters is that while Game of Thrones does still present Cersei as pretty forthrightly villainous, the narrative pretty drastically whitewashes Tyrion and Jaime. Essentially, it seems to take Tyrion and Jaime at their point of view word and treats them like they're much better people than they truly are. Thus, Jaime's ignominious end with the supposed biggest baddie of them all feels like a betrayal of his character development when it really shouldn't be. Every character needs to be held responsible for their own choices, but the downfall of House Lannister really does rest in the hands of Tywin. And Game of Thrones ignoring that fact did a disservice to every one of the Lannister children in one way or another. Yes, out of all of the Lannisters, Jaime was as close as Tywin could get to the golden child of his dreams. But it's easy to overlook that while Jaime may have been the favorite on the surface, every single one of Tywin's children was disgustingly mistreated, and the effects of his abuse all showed themselves in different malignant ways. While Jaime may have gotten preferential treatment over his siblings, Tywin was never anything other than a terrible parent. And more importantly, Jaime's superior treatment only told him exactly how he could expect to be treated if he ever failed to live up to his father's high ideals. And of course, in many big and small ways, he did ultimately fail to live up to Tywin Lannister's exacting standards. Tywin was a terrible parent because he was an abuser, but he also raised his children with his own values of pride, entitlement, and superiority. Obviously, The notion that they were simultaneously failures who had earned their own mistreatment, but were also Lannisters who deserved to be above everyone else, are opposing perspectives that are in constant conflict with one another. But it also seems to be how Cersei, Jaime, and Tyrion see themselves as constant victims, while still perennially victimizing others. George R.R. Martin has repeatedly discussed that one of the strongest themes of his work is the idea of the human heart in conflict with itself. Game of Thrones lost the plot with this in nearly every character adaptation. But Jaime's was one of the worst, largely because he is a character who has done some of the most monstrous and most heroic things in the story. He is both the man who doesn't hesitate to murder a child, and the man who stopped a king from slaughtering thousands, and therefore, his inner conflict is extremely vital. Jaime's character arc in Game of Thrones follows a classic redemption arc almost perfectly, but that clearly doesn't seem to be the intent behind the character in the books. Yes, there is a part of Jaime that wants to be redeemed, but he does often revert back to his more brutal and nihilistic side. And his desire for so-called redemption seems to be driven more by how he wants the world to see him, rather than how he wants to be. And in that sense, the show did him a great disservice. Because there are many ways in which Jaime hasn't healed from Tywin's abuse. But the fact that he still seeks the approval of others in a rather superficial manner, rather than developing a deeper understanding of true honor and justice, is one of the clearest indications that, while Jaime does want to get out of the path that his father laid out for him, he is still crippled by what Tywin told him being a Lannister meant. And ironically, Tywin's belief about what being a Lannister means has essentially trapped all of his children into trying and failing to live up to that example, simply because they can't survive unless they do. Because ultimately, it's not necessarily just about what Jaime or Cersei or Tyrion wants. At some point, every single one of them has made obvious indications that they don't want to be a part of the legacy that Tywin Lannister laid out for them. But when Game of Thrones presented Tywin as a super intelligent master strategist, instead of a completely unnecessarily violent and aggressive asshole, it made all the Lannister children's choices harder to understand. Both in the A Song of Ice and Fire and Game of Thrones fandoms, Tywin is typically put up on a pedestal, and that's completely baffling. Many viewers and readers perceive him to be brilliant and badass, but everything that Tywin is famous for actually makes him seem like a complete moron upon further contemplation. Winning battles by absolutely obliterating your enemies is a terrible precedent to set for many reasons. But one of the biggest is that it essentially requires all the Lannister children to maintain this scorched earth policy because Tywin's hyper-aggressive superiority complex has put them in a position where they almost always have to choose to kill or be killed. And his cruel and dishonorable behavior, as well as Jaime's reputation as the Kingslayer, essentially guarantees that even if Jaime completely changes as a person and becomes the hero that he wants to be, he really can't ever become that in the society that he lives in, simply because the stigma around the Lannisters is something he can't escape. That is one of the great tragedies that Game of Thrones failed to articulate. And that is one of the biggest reasons why Jaime's character conclusion was so off-putting to the audience. Because the audience saw the result of where this character arc would naturally go, but the story never actually took the steps to get it there. In fact, the show went out of its way to erase a lot of the obvious building blocks that are leading up to both Cersei and Jaime's demise, that make it clear that, while they're obviously responsible for their own choices and actions, the groundwork that Tywin's abuse and cruelty laid and set in stone was something that they couldn't control, prevent, or undo. Game of Thrones largely presented Jaime's characterization with the implication that if he could only escape Cersei, he would be a good man. But the reality was, if only Tywin hadn't been his father, then all of his siblings would have been better people. They may not have been good, but they almost certainly wouldn't be the kingdom-destroying villains that they became. I also think the TV series likely bungled his character in that his story is meant to be a subversion of the classic redemption arc, rather than the straightforward bad guy to good guy story that Game of Thrones told. George R.R. Martin obviously doesn't like flawless characters, and nearly every person in A Song of Ice and Fire does good things and bad things all the time. They never go in a straight line from point A to point B. So, of course it was going to be incredibly jarring when the show did move Jaime in a straight line from point A to point B, and then abruptly gave him an ending that is probably somewhat similar to his end in the books. But with that in mind, for all the faults in Game of Thrones and the way they handled Jaime's character arc, I don't really understand the idea that his character was ruined by his ending either. These characters are clearly designed to never just be one thing, and if Jaime killing Aerys or trying to kill Bran doesn't singularly define his character, then going back to Cersei in the very end shouldn't either. But what do you think? Leave your thoughts and opinions below, and if you're interested in more content like this, like and subscribe.